Hello, everyone. Carmen Johnson here with the Healthy Kids Revolution. We are just waiting momentarily to get started. And if you'll just I don't think there's any music playing, but just wanted to let you all know that Pam Colleen's presentation will start here in just a minute. So thanks for hanging on, and look for the slides. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Kids Revolution Summit. We are in our next day of expert advice coming in from Pam Colleen. I would love to welcome Pam. Pam, welcome so much to our summit.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Carmen. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And, you know, I'm so excited to share why Pam is here. She is going to give us something that I think all you moms and dads on the line are going to love, and it is that she's going to talk about brain-boosting foods for our kids. Obviously, the goal of our whole summit is to give you parents some very simple tools and strategies to use and to uncomplicate the mess that we have as far as the diets and guidelines that we have in our world as far as getting our kids healthy. And Pam's got some great information. So just so you'll know who Pam is, she is the author of Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic. And just because it says addiction, do not be confused to think that this is just about alcohol and drugs. She talks in her book about sugar being an addiction, foods being an addiction, and her reviews on that book are tremendous. She also co-authored the New York Times best-selling book, The Great Bird Flu Hoax. She's been independently studying nutrition and natural health for over 20 years, but she does not look old enough. I know her photo looks like she's 16, and I know we all hate her when she looks so beautiful, but she's been studying this stuff for 20 years from her own problems, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, multiple chemical insensitivities, and not insensitivities, multiple chemical sensitivities. That's a mouthful. And then ADD. So she is clearly experienced from a very personal perspective of how our bodies react when we feed our bodies nutritionally. So she has spent now these years being a nutritional consultant. She offers clients a very comprehensive program about balancing out your biochemistry and wonderful talk radio host. So we are so excited to have her here. And Pam, I know you've got a slideshow for us. I hope everybody has clicked over on the left on your screen where it says view the slides. And without further ado, Pam is going to share some super information for us on how to brain boost our kids with some certain foods. So Pam, you are welcome to take it away.
Thank you, Carmen. It's great to be here, and today I'm talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is, of course, nutrition and how food affects our mood. This is the reason why I wrote my last book, Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic. And one of the reasons why I wrote that book is because I'm so concerned about our children today. And so I want to start off with the first slide here, showing why I am so terribly concerned about our children and why my book is a call to action in order to help prevent, hopefully. I want to talk about this from a prevention standpoint. I want to be able to help people prevent this catastrophe that is going on right now with regards to the mental instability we're seeing among our youth. And I just want to show a few references here on this first slide where right now it's saying that depression is the fourth leading cause of disability worldwide, and by 2020 the World Health Organization is saying that depression is going to be the second leading cause of disability worldwide. Currently in North America, depression is the leading cause of disability already. So it's costing society, billions of dollars every single year. But because mood disorders and the associated addictions are the elephant in the room, Carmen, unfortunately people tend to turn a blind eye to this subject matter. When I look at these conditions, I see the physical contributions that create this mental instability among society today. So I'm going to be talking about that in this presentation. Next, of course, we see where I live here in London, Ontario. A school board actually did a survey among the teachers, and the teachers said that over 25% of children have some sort of mental health problem. This was not the case when I was in my teens or younger. I noticed that, of course, we always had eccentric or quirky kids in the classroom, but I certainly didn't see this mental instability among my peers when I was very young. And then, of course, here in Canada, front cover of Maclean's magazine saying that this generation of kids on campus in colleges and universities are called the broken generation, and the subtitle is Why So Many of Our Best and Brightest Students Report Feelings of Hopeless, Depressed, report feelings of hopelessness, depression, or even suicide. So this is an epidemic that we have on our hands. It is unprecedented, and I think that we need to start looking at the physical and nutritional reasons behind these issues. These are not conditions that are due to Ritalin deficiencies or Prozac deficiencies, okay? There are some real physical reasons for it. And the next slide, I'm showing just a cartoon of somebody who's drawn this, where what I try to do is summarize this phenomenon by asking people to avoid the middle aisles in a grocery store. That indeed, since the technologies have been developed to give food shelf life, it's these thousands and thousands of foods that line the middle aisles of a grocery store that essentially have contributed to not just this physical health crisis that we're seeing, but this mental health crisis that we're seeing. And I always say to my students that, you know, these middle aisles of a grocery store are actually blocking our view from seeing the real food that is in the outer periphery of the grocery store. So these middle aisles are blocking our view from seeing the chicken and the meat and the eggs and so on. If you visualize Little House on the Prairie, Carmen, and you see the general store in that series, and you walk in the general store, there's hardly any food in that general store, right? That you go to the general store to get maybe some sugar or some flour. You go there to get your clothes, whatever you may need in your household. But back in the 1800s, for example, most of us had a small family farm. We would have produced our food on our own. And the cows would have been outside, the pigs would have been outside, the chickens would have been outside. We had a very sustainable model of food, and in so doing, of course, we had much greater health in terms of our overall mental health and physical health than we do today. So we see this degeneration, this deterioration in quality of our food over the last 100 or so years since we've developed the technologies that allow for shelf stability. And so that's one of the reasons why I ask people just to avoid those middle aisles in a grocery store, because these foods that are sitting in the middle aisles are experimental foods, and we're the guinea pigs. And since this experiment has been snowballing over the last 100 years, of course, we're no better off for it. So the next slide, I want to point out just some graphics, some examples of how we got roped into buying these newfangled foods. And post-World War II, what happened was these newfangled foods really took off in the 1950s. And at first, and I don't want to sound chauvinistic here, but the women back then, of course, did most of the shopping. And so the women were looking at these foods with a tremendous amount of, suspicion that they really did not take to these foods at first. And so when surveys were done in the 1950s asking women about these foods, if women had purchased these foods, they admitted that they felt shame and they felt guilt for buying these foods. And so the food industry had a conundrum and said, oh boy, how do we please our shareholders, because we've got shareholders vested in this. We have to make sure that consumers buy these products. So what the food industry did was they actually financially influenced the ladies' magazines at the time and the food writers to slant articles and to slant ads to tell women that making food from scratch was an inferior task, that buying these newfangled foods would make them more progressive as women, more modern. And so, and then really, Carmen, this is still a very pervasive message that's among us today. And so people view cooking food from scratch as a menial task, even today. And when you look at the television and you look at the Food Network, for example, and all of the cooking demonstrations that we see on television, I have to ask myself some days, are people just living vicariously through these food shows where we are being shown how to cook food from scratch? So are we actually watching these shows just for entertainment, or are we actually learning from these shows so that we can go into the kitchen and make food from scratch, which is really the healthiest way to cook? And I don't see it happening, quite honestly. People are living in this fast new world, and we're really not honoring this really age-old type of tradition where we knew that homemade meals were much, much healthier than these newfangled foods and fast foods that really are just so pervasive today.
Mm-hmm.
So the next slide, I want to point out that one of the greatest changes in our food supply over the last 100 years has been the introduction of plant-based oils like soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, cottonseed oil, and how these oils and the associated spreads or margarines have displaced more nutrient-dense foods like butter, lard, and tallow. I want to point out that these are newfangled foods that our bodies are just not adjusting well to these oils, that we're really not designed for these types of fats, that really as we evolved as a species, of course, in order for our brains to have developed, that we would have depended upon the fats that come from animal foods. Historically, of course, we knew that these animal fats were considered in many cultures all around the world as being sacred foods. And so as we have gradually introduced these newfangled oils and spreads and margarines in our diet, and we see this graph here showing how much they have invaded our food supply over the last 100 years, that certainly as we've introduced these foods, we've seen a degradation in our overall physical health, but not just that, also our mental health as well. So it's the displacement of these newfangled foods in our diet that has caused a lot of the health problems that we're seeing today. So we need to go back to the way we used to eat before we started suffering with what I call fat phobia, cholesterol phobia. Before we had these phobias, these food phobias, we were much healthier than we are now. And this, really started transpiring after we invented hydrogenation in 1909, but really catapulted post World War II. And so in that era, between 1909 and the post-World War II era, we really had a chance still to be healthy because still many of us were happily eating things like butter and lard and tallow. We were slowly reducing our consumption of these foods, but still we had a chance to be healthy before World War II because we didn't suffer from fat phobia, cholesterol phobia, bacon phobia, liver phobia, red meat phobia, dairy phobia, chicken skin phobia, gravy phobia. We didn't have these food phobias before World War II, and we were much, much healthier both physically and mentally in that era than we are today, now that we unfortunately suffer with these food phobias. So let's go to the next slide here, and I'll just show you another graphic showing how they're even predicting potentially more sales of these newfangled oils and fats in our society, and that's going to lead to even more health problems, both mental and physical, as we progress. And then the next slide, I just want to show you some research that has been published in Psychosomatic Medicine, basically saying that the imbalance of fatty acids in the typical first world diet is likely associated with the sharp increase in depression and inflammatory diseases seen over the past century. So this essentially encapsulates this shift that we've seen in our fats, in the consumption of our fats in our diet over the last 100 years, and in particular even more so the last 50 years or so in our diet. That even the scientific literature is actually showing that we should not have displaced the animal fats, and we shouldn't have, really bombarded our dinner plates with these plant-based oils and fats as much as we have. So the next slide, number 8, I'm going to show here a slide that is showing that indeed we have dramatically reduced our consumption of foods like butter. That line, that red line that's going across the page, could easily be eggs, meat, tallow, lard. I mean, we have seen a sharp reduction in a lot of these types of traditional foods in our diet over the last 50 to 60 years. And as we have been reducing these foods, of course, we see an increase in chronic diseases like heart disease and cancer. But we also see more mental instability as well. And we can see by looking at this graph that by reducing animal fats in our diet, and in this case I'm looking at butter, there's no correlation whatsoever between eating things like butter and heart disease or cancer, but yet the media and even the commercials we see on television today still tell us that these saturated fats will cause things like heart disease. And nothing could be further from the truth, of course, because when we were eating most of our diet, and keep in mind before World War II, when we were much healthier, we would have gotten about 70% of our calories from animal fat. So after World War II, that's when we start to reduce our consumption of these traditional foods, and that's when we start to see the rise of illnesses such as cancer, heart disease, and even more mental disorders in society. And the next page is just a chart showing our increase in consumption of sugar. And so back in the 1700s, of course, we would have only eaten about 4 pounds of sugar per person per year. And dramatically, we've seen increases in this in our sugar consumption. And what happened post-World War II, of course, is that we start to see a rise of heart disease as the displacement of traditional foods had already been taking place somewhat in society. And so heart disease started to increase circa around 1920. And so around 1950 or so, heart disease was getting a lot of media attention, and even the president at the time, around that time, had heart disease. So the scientific community was scrambling around trying to find reasons why we were seeing so much heart disease. And unfortunately, we took our eye off the target. Professor John Yudkin, who is out of the UK, he was saying it was our increase in consumption of sugar that was causing the inflammation that was leading to heart disease. But he was very quiet and very shy man. And on this side of the pond in the United States, Dr. Ansel Keys, he was saying it was the animal fat and cholesterol that was causing the rise in heart disease. But Ansel Keys was very charismatic, very gregarious. The media really liked him. And unfortunately, the story rolled from Dr. Ansel Keys, and that's when we start to see that rather than blaming our increase in consumption of sugar on this rise in inflammation that was going on in society, we started blaming animal fat. So the wrong, food was being blamed on disease. We should have really been blaming sugar this entire time, or our increase in consumption of sugar, I should say. So on the next slide, I just want to point out that even the British Medical Journal is blaming sugar for a lot of the disease that we see today. The British Medical Journal here is saying, this dates back to 2005, I think it is, sugar is as dangerous as tobacco, and in terms of world health, far more important. Sugar is an enormous burden throughout life. It destroys children's teeth, it leads to obesity, and it exacerbates diabetes, a disease that eventually destroys every organ. Sugar should be classified as a hard drug, for it is addictive and harmful. And then finally, the British Medical Journal is saying there will be a considerable cost attached to the cessation of sugar consumption, but this will be negligible in comparison with the cost of the disease burden attributable to sugar. So not only will we be healthier, we will save a lot of costs. And, of course, here we see in the entire continent in North America, both in Canada, where I live, and in the United States, of course, that our healthcare crisis is indeed bankrupting both of our countries, and we need to come up with some very tangible solutions for this problem. Now, the next slide, on slide 11, of course, when I'm talking about sugar, I'm not just talking about refined sugars. I'm also talking about sugar that is naturally occurring in fruits and vegetables and even grains. I'm not against the consumption of fruits and vegetables. I am against the overconsumption of fruits and vegetables. I'm a recovering raw food vegan, and I took it too literally, unfortunately. I ate way too many fruits and vegetables, and unfortunately it really starved my brain and damaged my metabolism dramatically. So I want to warn people not to overconsume these fruits and vegetables. We have indeed been listening to the USDA's food guide. In Canada, we have our own food guide. It's very similar. So we have, unfortunately, been listening to their advice where they say eat 5 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables on top of eating 6 to 11 servings of grains. What this means, Carmen, is that you're eating, sugar on top of sugar. That's what that means.
That's terrible.
So in my mind, carbohydrates are fruits, vegetables, grains, and also, refined sugars and even juices, of course, which are, drinking juice is like, eating a Snickers bar. Yeah, it's just loaded with sugar. So, yes, fruits and vegetables have their place. Of course, the antioxidants in these foods are great for preserving the animal fats that you're eating. But try not to overdo it, because keep in mind that eating too many fruits and vegetables in one setting could potentially throw off your blood sugar. So keep in mind as well that the last ice age ended 12,500 years ago, and we invented agriculture 10,000 years ago. So I constantly remind people that during the last ice age, 12,500 years ago, we did not have greenhouses back then. So we're really not designed to eat a lot of carbohydrates in our diet. And that indeed has led to our demise by listening to this kind of advice where we're being told to eat lots of fruits and vegetables. And let me switch to the next slide here, where I show that indeed we are indeed eating more grain in our diet. You know, that mantra that we hear so often in the media, Carmen, where they say, eat your whole grains, right?
Absolutely.
Well, you know, like I always say, sugar is sugar is sugar, and a grain is a grain is a grain. I mean, it's still a source of sugar, whether it's a whole grain or whether it's refined. It's still a source of sugar, and we need to be cautious about over-consuming grains. And I don't have time to get into this today, but of course if people are eating grain, grain should be pre-digested. So our ancestors knew that if we are going to eat grain, that it needs some preparation time. And that's why we see in so many cultures around the world that they have their own versions of sourdough bread in their diets, is because they knew that grain needed some TLC before consumption, that it needed to be fermented in order to, or soaked in order to break down what are known as anti-nutrients. So not only do I caution my clients not to over-consume grain, I am telling them if they do eat grain that it should be properly prepared in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So the next slide, I just want to show, again, some government numbers showing that indeed, in recent history, we have unfortunately been listening to government guidelines telling us to increase our consumption of carbohydrates, or what I also call plant-based foods. So here we see in this chart that we are indeed eating more carbohydrates, which means that we have displaced the animal fats and protein. So we have moved down in our consumption of fat, which is unfortunate, and we have also decreased our consumption of protein. And in this particular chart, this government chart, they're showing that this has an association with obesity. And keep in mind that with obesity, there are over 40 health-related problems associated with obesity. But I've added a sidebar here as well, showing that this dramatic change in our diet has also led to a host of other health problems as well, not just physical health problems, but mental health problems as well. So if we go to slide 14, what I'm saying here is that over-consuming carbohydrates, whether it's sugar, whether it's juice, whether it's too many fruits and vegetables or too much grain in the diet, puts us on a roller coaster ride in terms of our blood sugar control. And that is synonymous with saying hypoglycemia. And so we end up spiking our insulin, throwing ourselves on this blood sugar roller coaster ride, and this is essentially making us extremely vulnerable to mood issues. And I think a lot of your listeners will realize that, you know, just before a meal, if you've waited too long before a meal, a lot of people will report that they're grouchy and irritable. So we know that when blood sugar drops, it does have an influence on mood. So we, by straying from traditional eating habits, of course, we have set ourselves up for hypoglycemia, or what this slide is showing as the Hypoglycemic Syndrome, which can lead to things like depression, moodiness, tiredness, memory impairment, poor concentration, and even addiction issues. So let me elaborate a little bit more with regards to our children. So the next slide showing carbohydrate addiction in children. And I'm just going to, this is, I think, something I pulled out of my book, Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic. Our children are drowning in a flood of carbo-rich foods that are making them overweight, unfocused, undermotivated, hyperactive, and overly mood responsive. Carbohydrate addiction has been classified as a true addiction, and that victims get caught in a vicious carbo cycle. Excessive amounts of carbohydrates lead to abnormally high insulin levels, which lead to more intense carbohydrate cravings. Carbohydrate-addicted kids have a propensity for problems that include a range of behavior, mood, and learning disabilities. And some children, of course, have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. On the next slide, this is some information that I pulled from Carbohydrate-Addicted Kids, written by two doctors, Heller and Heller. The signs and symptoms of carbohydrate addiction, and many of your listeners probably can identify with this, is a focus on starchy foods, junk foods, snack foods, or sweets, often to the exclusion of other foods. A desire to snack rather than eat whole, balanced meals. You can see swings in energy levels, moods, ability to concentrate or motivation, unexplained outbursts of anger or periods of withdrawal, heightened emotionality, including sensitivity, crying, insecurity, or clinging, and weight problems or incidents of uncontrollable eating.
Wow.
And it's covering the full gamut, and unfortunately, a lot of people are very they don't connect, what the solution to this problem is. I see a lot of people running around trying to take supplements to fix this problem, when really one of the main things people can do to be healthy today is to return to the way we used to eat before World War II, when we were much more when we were healthier both mentally and physically. So we knew back in the 1940s to sit down and eat a bacon and egg style breakfast and a meat and potato style lunch and dinner. We didn't have any food phobias around those items back then, and we were much more stable. So slide 17 is just some research that was done back in the 1920s of autopsies of dead people. The people were dead from hypoglycemia, and these autopsies revealed widespread degeneration and necrosis of nerve cells, particularly in the cerebral cortex, the brain region responsible for higher intellectual function. So essentially, what these researchers noted was that hypoglycemia led to brain damage. And slide 18, just some more research here showing hyperinsulinemia, a common cause of persistent hypoglycemia in infants and children, can result in permanent damage to the central nervous system. And, of course, alcoholism, eating disorders, and many drug addictions are associated with abnormal glucose metabolism, and this is something that I highlight quite regularly throughout my book, Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic. Okay, so let's go to slide 19 about ADD and ADHD and hypoglycemia. And historically, of course, I've also been diagnosed with ADD myself. Many physicians and researchers believe that the symptoms of ADD and ADHD may be caused or exacerbated by food allergies or metabolic disorders such as hypoglycemia. There's that word again. Hypoglycemia is, of course, low blood sugar, or this roller coaster ride that we put ourselves on because we're not eating enough animal fat in our diet regularly throughout the day. Hypoglycemia can directly affect the cerebral cortex of the brain, so that perceptions can become distorted, learning becomes faulty, concentration drops off, rage can develop, and criminal behavior can occur. Other problems resulting from hypoglycemia can include depression, memory loss, psychosis, violence, insomnia, and so on. So there is growing research here showing that that eating too many carbohydrates is deleterious to our health. The next slide, slide 20, I'm showing some research that was done back in 1976, where for 5 weeks students were allowed to eat what they wanted from meat, fruit, and vegetables with a carbohydrate intake between 60 and 120 grams. After that, objective tests were administered. IQ scores had increased in some children, but it was not clear if this was a result of diet or instruction. After all the tests were administered, the children were allowed to eat a high carbohydrate breakfast. Within a half an hour of breakfast, student behavior began to disintegrate. There were fights, crying, giggly talkativeness, and falling up the stairs like a bunch of drunks. The older students who had previously displayed self-control began smart-mouthing their friends and instructors. And by 10:30 in the morning, there had been numerous reports of stomach aches and vomiting. And further to this study, slide 21, when the IQ tests were done, it said here, instead of scores rising, the IQs of at least 9 children had dropped below 75, which would merit a diagnosis of mental retardation. So here they're even saying that our intelligence, of course, is potentially adversely affected by eating too many carbohydrates. So the next slide, slide 22, I want to show you a visual of what this means in terms of this roller coaster ride that we're putting ourselves on simply because we're dysregulating our blood sugar by eating all of these wonderful healthy fruits and vegetables and grains that our government is telling us to eat. And here we see a huge contradiction in a medical text that I actually own, and it's dated from 1944. And this is just something I've scanned, so the quality of this slide isn't the greatest, but I think you can see the outline of the graph where you see the rise in blood sugar after eating a high carbohydrate meal versus what you actually want, which is the dotted line underneath it. You want your blood sugar to be relatively level after a meal. You don't want it to spike very, very high. You want it to be level. And here, the doctors make this astounding recommendation, which was very common back then, to eat lots of animal fat in the diet. In fact, here, underlined in red, it says eat between 65 and 75% fat in the diet. Of course, back then, that would have meant animal fat. because we didn't have animal fat or cholesterol phobia back then. So here you see the doctors from a medical school saying that to regulate your blood sugar, which means regulating your mood, which means feeding your brain, that you need to get adequate amounts of animal fat in the diet. And so it's unfortunate that now we see the opposite today coming from our medical schools and our governments and even the media, that unfortunately the advice they're giving us today is the absolute opposite. We don't have any historic reference to eating a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. Historically, man has always eaten a very high fat diet. And if we hadn't, of course, our brains wouldn't have evolved as much as they have today. In fact, the research is showing that as we have been displacing animal foods and replacing them with more plant-based foods, that indeed our brains are actually shrinking.
Wow.
So let's go to what this means in terms of our nervous system, essentially, our neuroendocrine system, if you will. A lot of what I do centers around regulating people's blood sugar. That's very, very important. But one of the reasons why it's important to regulate your blood sugar is because it takes a lot of the stress or the burden off of your body's batteries, or what are called the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are what I call the body's batteries. And the adrenal glands carry many, many roles. They're not only responsible for producing things like sex hormones, they're also responsible for controlling the balance of minerals in our body. And under that umbrella, that also means that the adrenal glands play a very crucial role in terms of their ability to kick out unwanted or excess metals. So when metals start to overaccumulate in the body, now these can be toxic metals like mercury, lead, etc., but they can also be healthy minerals like copper, which we are unfortunately overexposed to today for many, many reasons that I don't have time to get into right now. But we don't want to overaccumulate metals in our body. We want them to be balanced, and the adrenal glands play a very, very crucial role in terms of balancing minerals. Now, what I say here is this: I want to basically talk about why we're seeing so much illness today, and I want people to connect the dots, because if people don't understand these fundamental principles, they could scramble around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years looking for answers to their health problems, but without understanding the root cause of their health problems. That's the average client that I see, is that they've been scrambling around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years looking for answers, but not understanding these fundamental principles. So, number one, we need to regulate our blood sugar. One of the reasons why we need to regulate our blood sugar is so that we relax. We keep the adrenal glands in a state of relaxation. They are a backup system to controlling our blood sugar as well. But we don't want to turn to the adrenal glands to control our blood sugar. We want to keep those adrenal glands in a nice, relaxed mode. So if we're skipping meals, if we're waiting too long in between meals, or if we're not eating enough animal fat in our diet, then we are going to destabilize our blood sugar, and then the adrenal glands are going to be in an alarm state. They are going to be turned on when really they're not designed to be turned on that often, okay? And so over time, because we are using this backup system from the adrenal glands, then they will get weak, okay? And one of the reasons why you don't want the adrenal glands to get weak is because, like I said, that they are also balancing minerals in the body, and they are also responsible for sending out messages in the body to grab at excess or unwanted metals, whether it's mercury, lead, or excessive copper in the body, and these proteins are supposed to grab at these unwanted metals and take them to your bile and then exit. And the bile is supposed to take these metals out into the toilet where they belong. And unfortunately, because we have reduced our consumption of animal fat in the diet, which by default means we have also reduced our consumption of dietary cholesterol, now we run into lots of problems. So let me show you what that means for the next slide here, Carmen. Actually, let me skip the slide on the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, if people just take a quick look here, show that they are responsible for producing the adrenaline or the fight or flight hormones, but also they're responsible for producing our sex hormones or our chill out, relaxing hormones, and we need to make sure that the adrenal glands are not too stressed too often in the course of the day so that we can produce things like progesterone, estrogen, DHA, pregnenolone, and so on. Unfortunately, our adrenal glands are so busy in this fight or flight mode that the other important jobs like pushing out estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all these hormones become compromised because the adrenal glands are busy doing other things. But let me show you the next slide where I talk about, on slide 25, the gallbladder and bile production. So without enough animal fat in the diet, without enough dietary cholesterol in the diet, then what happens, Carmen, is bile production becomes compromised. And as I mentioned, that for the body to regulate and get rid of unwanted metals, bile needs to be very thin. We need to be producing probably up to a liter of bile a day. But as we have reduced our consumption of animal fat and cholesterol in our diet, bile production has gotten sluggish, if you will. And so it gets backed up. And so our ability to kick out metals is compromised. And so this is so core to the work that I do, jump-starting bile production in the body. This is not easy to do, Carmen. If we had never turned to a low-fat diet, if we had never become animal fat or cholesterol phobic, this impairment wouldn't be an issue today, because the key thing is that since the dawn of civilization, we have confronted things like heavy metals in society today. Our bodies actually should have the wherewithal to know what to do with these metals and to kick them out appropriately. But because our adrenal glands have gotten so weak and because bile production has become so impaired, we have lost the ability to kick out unwanted metals. And keep in mind that when metals get backed up in the body, this will impair mood. This will throw off neurotransmitters. This will impair thyroid function. This will impair hormones, essentially. So I see a lot of people running around trying to take supplements or drugs to help fix a lot of these problems. But until we actually turn the adrenals back on appropriately, until we balance the minerals, until we boost bile production so that the metals take their exit like they should have been all along, it's very hard to get people back running on all 8 cylinders. So I tell people this from a prevention standpoint, because fixing these problems after they have become an issue is very difficult to do. That's what I do with my clients. It takes really an average of 2 years to undo the damage done by this impairment. So let's talk about this from a preventative standpoint, that really if people can understand the last few slides and eat the way our ancestors ate when we were pretty healthy, then these systems should be clicking along quite nicely, and I wouldn't be as busy as I am today. So anyway, there's lots more I can say about this slide on the gallbladder and bile. If we're producing enough bile, of course, we need that bile to be produced appropriately so that we can absorb things like minerals, calcium, iron, zinc, magnesium, and these wonderful long-chain fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins that occur in these animal fats that our ancestors, of course, thrived and survived on quite nicely. So the next slide, slide 26, is showing that the government is contradicting itself here, because the government is telling us to eat a low-fat diet, which historically, of course, we know the meaning of low-fat is a diet low in animal fat. And here the government is saying that, there's a warning here about low-fat diets, saying that they're associated with lower levels of calcium, zinc, magnesium, iron, phosphorus, vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin B12, vitamin B6, folic acid, and niacin. And these nutrients are crucial for brain function, for your overall metabolism. I mean, these are very, very important nutrients, and yet the government is saying that their own advice essentially is leading to malnutrition. This is just criminal, quite honestly. So here we see slide 27, a cartoon. I feature this cartoon in my book, actually, where 2 students are talking to each other, and one is saying, trade you some Cheetos and a Ritalin for your cupcake and a Zoloft.
Oh my God.
And, of course, then I cite, it takes an extraordinary intelligence to contemplate the obvious. I mean, these foods are not sustaining our health, both physically and mentally. And it's no wonder our teachers here where I live in London, Ontario, are saying that over 25% of our students have some sort of mental disorder. Yet I don't see the school systems taking the appropriate action. In fact, I read about this in my book because, yes, there's a lot of healthy school initiatives out there, but unfortunately what they deem to be healthy is still not healthy enough for our precious children.
Right.
A lot of these healthy school initiatives are actually promoting a high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet, which is unacceptable for our children. I see some of these healthy school initiatives are serving things like juice instead of whole milk. I see some of these healthy school initiatives are promoting lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and even grain in the diet, which is still unacceptable. These healthy school initiatives should be more focused on making sure that the children are getting enough animal fat in the diet. And in fact, I have a book. It's 100 years old, Carmen, and it's written by, at the time, a woman who was considered the world authority on school feeding. And back 100 years ago, if a child had behavior or learning problems, the child would be sent away to a special school for 3 months. And it wasn't to discipline the child. They sent these children away to special schools to feed them properly. And what they would be fed would be things like more meat and butter. And so they would actually get lots of meat and butter in their diet. They would stabilize their mood and their learning behaviors, and they would go back into regular schools. Because back then, the people in charge of school feeding knew that when kids were not eating enough meat and butter, that this would adversely affect their mood and their learning ability. Because in many cases, of course, rather than eating meat and butter, these families were from low incomes potentially, and they would have been eating things like, canned vegetables or drinking coffee instead of whole milk, or other foods that were displacing these more nutrient-dense animal foods. So the next slide is an indictment from the World Health Organization. It was a publication that came out in 2003 from the World Health Organization, basically saying that processed foods are causing chronic disease and obesity. Here we see it, and unfortunately this seminal report that was published didn't hardly make any news media sources anywhere in the world. It was a blip on the screen, and of course one of the reasons why there's so much suppression in terms of this information is because this would hurt the sponsors of people in the media. They would not be too pleased by this report. So unfortunately, even our public health officials haven't done anything to warn us about the damaging effects of processed foods.
And so, Pam, when you're talking about processed foods, can I ask you something just to clarify to make sure the big deal with that is the partially hydrogenated oils? Is that
it's mostly... Yeah, in general terms, it's the foods that sit in the middle aisles of a grocery store. In very simple terms, I don't have a lot of time to itemize things here, but that's how I like to globalize it. And then you really processed, when I'm talking about processed foods, I mean industrially processed foods. These are foods that have gone through an assembly line typically. They've been heavily adulterated by man. These are foreign foods. These are foods that a caveman would not recognize, essentially. Okay.
Gotcha. And then the distinction between the animal fats and the plant fats. Can you maybe talk just in very layman's terms, just briefly, because I know you have a lot more slides, but I just want to make sure that everybody is staying with us in the keeping it simple mode. Mm-hmm. What is the difference between the consumption of animal fats versus plant fats and the effect on cell and brain development?
Well, the animal fats
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the animal fats are essentially what we evolved on. They are the foods. They never joined the dark side, okay? It's these edible oils that are newfangled foods that are basically foreign to our body. We're really not adapted to these plant-based oils. You know, pressing oil from a plant is a relatively new phenomenon to man. Historically, we relied on animal fats to satisfy our appetites, right? If you look at the word satisfy, sated, saturated, right? When we eat enough animal fat in the diet, it satisfies our appetite. But animal fats are also crucial for brain health. They're also crucial for the health of the cell membrane. You're only really as healthy as your cell membrane. And when you look at the structure of the cell membrane, you'll find out that the fats that come from animal foods are indeed the fats that are crucial for making sure that your cell membrane is formed properly. The cell membrane, essentially, if you look at it structurally and you compare it to building a house, right, you want your house to be structurally sound, right? But if you're not giving your body the correct fuel to form the cell membrane in a healthy manner, you're just not going to be healthy. And the components of animal fat essentially are there to help support the cell membrane. And the components of plant-based fats and oils, unfortunately, really don't play a huge role in terms of supporting cell membrane health. The emphasis really in our diet does need to come from animal fats.
Awesome.
Does that make
sense? Thank you for clarifying that. It does, and I want to just make sure, we're keeping it simple and that everybody that's tuning in is going, okay, I understand that now. I understand why plant versus animal fats, and there's a difference in how the cell membrane, and earlier one of the prior presentations by yours truly, myself, was about the cell membrane. So hopefully now everybody can connect that presentation earlier in this summit to now what you're presenting here as far as the difference and distinction in fat. So I'm sorry to interrupt you there. You can certainly keep going, but wanted to make that clarifying point.
Not a problem. No, I don't mind
okay,
if you want to jump in every so often. Here we see on the next slide from BBC News where they're showing that depression is linked to processed foods. So more attention in the media here showing that there's a study that adds to an existing body of solid research that shows the strong links between what we eat and our mental health. So again, this mental health, this mental instability we're seeing in society today is not due to a Prozac deficiency or a Ritalin deficiency. It is clearly malnutrition. And from my book, I have some studies that I've cited. I'll just go through them here. Children on low-fat diet suffer from growth problems and failure to thrive. A low-fat diet is associated with greater feelings of depression, dejection, and anger. In contrast, a high-fat diet is associated with improvements in mood. A low-fat diet is associated with a significant increase in deaths from accidents, suicide, and violence. A low-fat diet may impair cognitive function. Depressed individuals tend to consume more carbohydrates in their diets than non-depressed individuals. And research shows that eating adequate amounts of complete protein can increase alertness. And hopefully that protein is fatty protein.
Mm-hmm.
So going back to cholesterol, of course, cholesterol is important for many, many things, including the production of bile and including, of course, the production of hormones, sex hormones. So, and we see here it's also important for the cell membrane elasticity and strength, and it's necessary for brain and nerve development and so on. So let's take a look on the next slide here, too, where even according to a psychiatric journal here, showing that low cholesterol is linked to depression, suicidality, violence, aggressive, and impulsive behaviors. And on slide 33, again, there's just a flow chart showing how cholesterol is necessary for the production of hormones. But let's not forget, because our bodies can and do produce, cholesterol is such an important nutrient, of course, our bodies produce about 75% of it. 25% of it, however, should be coming from exogenous or outside sources, and that's one of the reasons why we need it from an outside source, because it really is important for bile production. But also within the animal fat, you're not just going to find the cholesterol. You're going to find what are known as these wonderful fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A. So within the fat, you need the vitamin A in order to allow for the conversion of these hormones to take place. This is the importance of not isolating nutrients. This is why we need the whole food. And so it's nice that I'm seeing some cholesterol supplements on the market, and they can be very, very helpful, but I think we do need to get the cholesterol from a whole food form, so we are also getting enough of these fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A, and I will be talking a little bit more about that.
Okay.
So slide 34, again, cholesterol showing that it's an essential nutrient. Cholesterol deficiency is associated with preterm delivery, abnormally small head size in babies. The low cholesterol is associated with increased mortality and increased risk of psychiatric disorders, neurological disorders, infectious diseases, and cancer. And in two studies of autism, more than 50% of children with autism were deficient in cholesterol. So this is, again, something that we're now seeing even in association with things like autism. It's remarkable. In my book, I have an interview with Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride, who wrote the book Gut and Psychology Syndrome. As a medical doctor, Natasha was able to cure her son of autism, and of course, what did she do? She made sure her son was getting adequate amounts of animal fat and dietary cholesterol in his diet, and now he's just a normal teenage kid. So something that we're overlooking here is the importance of cholesterol. Now, in a nutshell, I don't have a lot of time to talk about one of my nutritional heroes here, but that is Dr. Weston A. Price and his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And in a nutshell, I will just summarize what he did back in the 1930s and 1940s. Of course, I highly recommend everybody read his book. But what he did in the 30s, as he started as a dentist, he started to see children with cavities and crooked teeth and narrow jaws. And he became very curious about this phenomenon because, of course, he was treating the parents of these children, and the parents didn't have these issues, but the children did. And we're starting to see in the 1930s the displacing nature of some of these newfangled foods that were rising up in the marketplace. And so he knew that there had to have been some sort of nutritional connection, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. So he took a camera with him, and he started traveling around the world looking at primitive cultures and looking at the status of their health, both their physical health and their dental health. And in cultures where they were eating their traditional foods, where they hadn't yet displaced their traditional foods with modern industrialized foods, that they had not just excellent overall physical health, they also had very, very healthy dental structures. So he didn't see necessarily the cavities, the crooked teeth, the narrowing of the jaw. And so I just have one slide that I want to show you here that kind of, I think, best encapsulates what he discovered. And this was off the coast of Scotland, off the very northern coast of Scotland on an island where he ran into these two brothers. One of the brothers here on the Isle of Harris, we can see in this picture, the one brother had displaced his traditional foods, and he started eating things like white bread jam, highly sweetened coffee, and also sweet chocolates. And his father told Dr. Price with a deep concern how difficult it was to get this son out of bed in the morning and go to work. Whereas the other brother, who had excellent dental health, he had maintained his traditional diet of primitive foods like oatmeal, oat cake, and seafoods, and some limited dairy. And, of course, the dairy would have been farm-fresh raw dairy. So we see here reference not just to physical degeneration happening with the son, the brother here who was eating the displacing foods. We also see mention of his mental health, his psychological state. And myself, as somebody who had chronic fatigue, debilitating chronic fatigue for many, many years, I know what it feels like to have trouble getting out of bed in the morning. And this is unfortunately something that I see that is a very pervasive problem among our youth today. And I think a lot of people are, ignoring the meaning behind this sluggishness that we're seeing among our children today. A lot of parents and people are commenting on how cute it is that it's tough to get Johnny out of bed in the morning. I don't find this cute at all. I think that after a good night's sleep, you've recharged your batteries, hopefully, and children should wake up in the morning excited about the day, jubilant. They shouldn't have this lethargy or fatigue that they're feeling in the morning. If you're seeing these symptoms, it's a clear red flag, and something needs to be done to fix it. I have a friend who works for the school board, and she says it's amazing how many children line up to get late slips in the morning for school, and the reason why they put on the late slip is because they couldn't get out of bed in the morning, and this was not
the parents can't get out of bed.
That's true. That's true.
Right, the parents aren't eating well either, and the parents can't get out of bed.
That's right. And so, it's tragic. It's just tragic, and the people are calling it cute, and we're almost normalizing it today, but it's certainly not cute, and it's certainly not normal. So the next slide is a summary. Just one of the most important observations of Dr. Price is that these primitive diets contained about 4 times the calcium and other minerals and 10 times the fat-soluble vitamins as the modern American diet. So let me elaborate on what that actually means, Carmen. On the slide 38, when I'm talking about the fat-soluble vitamins, we think about vitamin A, vitamin D, and we think about things like cod liver oil, which children would have gotten quite commonly before World War II. Vitamin A is crucial for the thyroid gland, protein and mineral assimilation, hormone production, and many other processes. And vitamin D, of course, is critical for insulin production, mineral metabolism, muscle tone, brain function, and many other processes. So very, very crucial vitamins. And what Dr. Price noted, as I mentioned, is that in primitive cultures, in healthy primitive cultures, that these cultures got adequate amounts of these nutrients. And we're just not getting enough of these nutrients today. And one of the reasons why, if we look at this next slide, slide number 39, and we look at the sources of vitamin A and vitamin D, and a lot of these foods would be very familiar to our ancestors. They wouldn't have any fear over eating things like organ meats or eggs or butter or the fat of birds like ducks or geese. I mean, they didn't have any of these food phobias. They would have gladly eaten these foods. And, of course, these are wonderful sources of vitamins A and D. And they're highlighted in red simply because of the irony behind this situation, because it's our government who is telling us not to eat these foods, yet our ancestors survived and thrived quite nicely on these foods. And so the next slide, number 40, is from Chris Masterjohn, and here he's showing that this marriage, this medley of these nutrients that are naturally occurring in animal fat are crucial in order to stabilize our nervous system. They help to regulate very important chemicals in the body called dopamine and cortisol, which are very important in terms of regulating our mood, in terms of regulating things like anxiety, depression, and motivation. So again, I'm not talking about isolating these nutrients. I'm talking about the marriage of them and why our ancestors did so well eating things like fatty meats and eggs with the yolk in there, and butter and lard and tallow, is that the marriage of these nutrients are crucial for our nervous system. And I always tell my clients that the best fuel for the adrenal glands is animal fat, bar none, okay?
Okay.
So, the next slide, slide number 41, there's a lot of wrongful demonization over something that is naturally occurring in animal fat. This is something you will find in meat and eggs and butter, is arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is one of the most abundant fatty acids in the brain. It serves many important purposes. Deficiencies of arachidonic acid can lead to several health complications. Patients with autism, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression show low levels of arachidonic acid in their bodies and could be worsened by eating a diet low in animal fat. Individuals with ADHD have significantly lower levels of both arachidonic acid and DHA. Of course, both of these fats are naturally occurring in animal fats. Alcoholics tend to be very deficient in DHA and arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid increases sleep quality during the night and increases energy during the day. And invariably, when I get my students and my clients to consume more animal fat in the diet, typically they come back to me and they tell me that they have more energy and their sleep improves. And I will add a side note to that. If people have been following a low-fat diet, that is, if anybody has been following a diet low in animal fats and they start to reintroduce animal fats in their diet, it can take some retraining of the digestive system to gracefully, shall we say, digest these animal foods. That some people can and do experience discomfort when they slowly or even quickly reintroduce these foods into their diet. It can take some time to remind the digestion to digest these traditional ancestral foods. That essentially the digestive system has gone to sleep and it forgets essentially forgets to digest these traditional foods. So sometimes strategies need to be implemented in order to boost the digestive tract. I don't have a lot of time to get into that today, but that's what I have to do with my clients when I work with them individually, is to give them strategies to help them digest these foods that we really shouldn't have ever been afraid of in the first place. Now, the next slide, 42, I'm just showing you I'll be showing you some graphs, just very simplistically here, showing you that arachidonic acid you can find in things like egg yolks and organ meats. These foods, of course, should be rich in arachidonic acid and are wonderful, wonderful brain food. Excellent. The next slide, 43, subjects with ADHD reporting many symptoms indicative of essential fatty acid deficiency had significantly lower proportions of plasma, arachidonic acid, and DHA. Here's some more research showing that arachidonic acid and DHA were significantly lower in subjects with ADHD. So essentially they're not eating enough animal foods in their diet.
Right. Okay.
Slide 44. There's just another nutrient I want to point out here that happens to also be rich in things like organ meats. Remember, our grandmothers told us to eat liver once a week, right?
Oh.
So anyway.
That's an acquired taste. I've got to acquire that one.
So phosphatidylserine, another very important nutrient here, showing that phosphatidylserine improves memory, learning, and other cognitive functions in people who are substantially impaired compared to others in their age group. Phosphatidylserine can improve activities of daily living and other components of quality of life for people who suffer from more severe memory loss. Phosphatidylserine can improve negative mood or depression and ease anxiety in both young people and the elderly. Phosphatidylserine can help individuals cope with stress, both physical and emotional. And phosphatidylserine has the potential to help children with attention and behavior problems. So in my next slide, 45, again, just an overview quickly showing how important source. These things like organ meats have always been for our ancestors in terms of providing us with phosphatidylserine. And when I say, when I'm talking about meats like organ meats or muscle meats, of course, ideally you want to, if you can, get the gold standard and buy your meats, chicken or fish, even from wild sources. You want to make sure that the animals are in as close to their natural habitat as possible, right? I say that, though I don't want to scare anybody off eating the foods in the outer periphery of a grocery store that have gone through the assembly line process in terms of factory farming. I don't want to scare people off those foods if those are the most accessible ways to buy those foods. I have worked with people who are on very, very low incomes, and they don't necessarily have the means or the way to purchase food that comes from pasture-raised or wild sources. So all I ask my clients to do is to do the best they can with what they have. Because if I scare people off, and of course I'm against factory farming, that was the nature of my first book, but if I scare people off even the factory-farmed versions of meat and eggs, then unfortunately some people may just feel that all they can eat would be things like soy and salad, which would be doing our children a great disservice, of course. So people, just do the best you can with what you have. So slide 45 goes to 46, and want to point out as well that I don't work with people who don't eat red meat in the diet simply because I know it's one of the best sources of zinc. So I really encourage my clients to eat red meat, hopefully from pasture-raised sources, because of it being one of the best sources of zinc in the diet. Eggs and dairy are okay sources of zinc, but red meat is even a better source of zinc. So by avoiding beef, you are over 7 times more likely to suffer a zinc deficiency. And when I test my recovering vegetarian, call them, of course, I see a lot of copper. Zinc and copper have an antagonistic nature, and if people aren't eating enough red meat in the diet, unfortunately, copper starts to overaccumulate, and that causes a lot of mood issues. So please eat red meat in the diet. It's a lot easier to be healthy if you eat red meat than if you don't. And this is just a reference from Gary Taub's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. One French account from 1793 estimated that Americans ate 8 times as much meat as bread, and by one USDA estimate, the typical American was eating 178 pounds of meat annually in the 1830s, 40 to 60 pounds more than was reportedly being eaten a century later. So essentially, what this slide is saying is that we have used wheat to displace meat.
Wow.
And the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a recovering vegetarian. More and more vegetarians are coming forward talking about the deleterious health effects in their lives because of eating a vegetarian diet when genetically they weren't designed for vegetarianism. So here's just a few examples of books. On slide 48, one written by Lear Keith, another book written by John Nicholson, and another one written by Susan Schenck, talking about essentially how sick they got by following vegetarian or vegan diets. I ask people if they hear any nutritional advice today that they need to ask themselves these 5 questions. That to know whether or not the nutritional advice you're getting, it should show that for generation after generation after generation, that this proved that people could be healthy. And ask yourself, does this prove to me that couples are fertile, babies are healthy, that there's no chronic disease or mental disorders in society, that the aging are aging gracefully, and that senior citizens are still productive members of society? People are essentially too short-sighted in terms of listening to nutritional advice today. They're hearing nutritional advice that is essentially based upon either dogma, marketing-based science, urban myth, or wishful thinking. That really, to know whether or not the nutritional advice you're getting is correct, you have to look back several generations to see whether or not these 5 questions hold true, okay? So be very, very careful when you're hearing health claims out there today. Slide 49, I'm just finishing up here. Essentially, the components of a healthy traditional diet include these traditional healthy fats like butter, meat fats, egg yolks, and so on. Ideally, if they could be from pasture-fed sources. I'm a big proponent of raw, farm-fresh dairy products. The true superfoods would be things like cod liver oil and organ meats. Bone broth should be a regimen in your diet as well. They're fantastic for sealing and healing the gut lining, which, of course, your gut is your second brain, so you need to take care of it, and one of the best ways to do that is through bone broth. But also, of course, lacto-fermented foods are tremendous medicine for the gut. Things like sauerkraut, I tell all my clients, of course, sauerkraut is extremely medicinal food. These lacto-fermented beverages, the original forms of our pop today, like ginger ale, they used to be very medicinal if you make them yourself, and you can easily go online. In fact, on my website, pamcolleen.com, my second page is link after link after link in terms of how to how to make a lot of these foods in your own kitchen, and that includes these lacto-fermented beverages, which are much, much healthier than, of course, the stuff that we find on our grocery store shelves today. And, of course, the proper preparation of grains, nuts, and legumes. They need some TLC prior to consumption. So just as I finish up here, I just want to point out the importance of this age-old tradition of sitting down and eating a family meal and how important that is for not just the entire family, but in particular for children. And this is some research that came out just before I published my book, and it showed that compared to teens who have family dinners twice a week or less, teens who have dinner with their families 5 or more nights a week are 32% likelier never to have tried cigarettes, 45% likelier never to have tried alcohol, and 24% likelier never to have smoked pot. And, of course, the 51st slide is showing something that I think we've lost touch with, and this is this tradition of eating breakfast, a complete breakfast first thing in the morning, eating a complete lunch at noon, and eating a complete dinner at, say, 6 p.m. at night. Our bodies are designed to eat consistently through the day, that when we ate like this, Carmen, we have historical data, we have precedents showing that when we ate this way, we were actually pretty healthy. So when I ask my clients to eat 3 square meals a day, I know it's not sexy, and I know it's not a fad, so it's not new, and people love things that are new. I know it's kind of boring, Carmen, to recommend eating 3 square meals a day, considering how many food fads I get to hear out there. But when I tell people to eat 3 square meals a day, the way our ancestors used to eat, we're not guessing here. We know that when we ate 3 square meals a day, that before World War II, before we suffered with fat and cholesterol phobia and egg phobia and bacon phobia and red meat phobia and all those food phobias, when we sat down and ate these 3 square meals, we were healthy, both mentally and physically. So I'm urging your listeners to please disregard any kind of food fad that you listen to out there and just return to these basic premises that we know kept us healthy, okay? It's not difficult to eat 3 square meals a day. If our ancestors could do it, we can certainly do it. We have more kitchen gadgets than ever before in the history of mankind. We have cooking shows that show us how to cook meals from scratch. We have cookbook upon cookbook. We have so many means to teach us and help us make 3 square meals a day. So we don't really have a lot of excuses to do this. And I can't urge you enough to do this just for the sake of our children, for goodness sake. I mean, look at how sick they are today. Now our doctors are telling us on slide 52 that our children may not live as long as their parents. And then I talked about the next slide. The next slide is showing you some books, but on the first slide that I showed you, of course, reiterating this, that 25% of our kids have some sort of mental disorder today. And this is unprecedented, of course.
That's staggering.
So, again, I just want to point out, I get a lot of my information through the Weston A. Price Foundation, of which I'm a member. I pay every year to be a member of this organization. I can't thank, Dr. Weston A. Price and the president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, Sally Fallon. I can't thank them enough for encapsulating this work so that I can more completely understand really how easy it is to eat healthfully today. I always tell my clients that really healthy eating is very simple to do. What makes it very complicated is all of this misguided nutritional misinformation that we're getting today. So please simplify your lives for the sake of your children. Eat 3 square meals a day. These are 2 fabulous books by Sally Fallon. One is her cookbook called Nourishing Traditions, and her new book, The Nourishing Traditions Book of Baby and Child Care. And the next slide, slide 54, is just an image of my book, Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic, which is essentially a call to action for people to say that, if 25% of our children today have some sort of mental disorder, then what is going to happen to them in 10, 20, 30, 40 years? How are they going to function well in society if they're already showing signs of mental disability or any kind of mental disorder today, and if they are turning to drugs to stabilize themselves, then what's the future going to be like? How are they going to cope? So please, if you want to get more information, certainly I have a lot of this information in my book, Addiction, the Hidden Epidemic, and I also, on the next slide 55, I do have a books page where I highlight a lot of books that have common threads throughout them, teaching people, encouraging people to return to this paradigm of eating 3 square meals a day. So my website is just my name, www.pamkilleen.com, and I do a lot of radio shows, including mainstream radio, and I do archive a lot of those radio shows on my multimedia pages, so certainly feel free to take a listen there. If you'd like to friend me on Facebook, I'm also on Facebook. And one of the greatest resources out there, of course, for nutritional information is, no doubt, the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is www.westonaprice.org. And finally, thank you so much, Carmen, for inviting me to this event. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Oh, Pam, you have just given us an hour's worth of phenomenal information, and I know that's a lot for people to digest. And I hope that, they can obviously listen to the replay again. I think the replays will be available at least for another 72 hours after today's airing. So to kind of sum it up, hopefully you all took away massive notes. You had your pen and paper in front of you writing down all the things that Pam was sharing. And I think I wrote down my notes, loved so much of it, that if I could condense my notes, I would say that the 3 takeaways for parents, if you want to go, okay, what did Pam just say? She just said, avoid the middle aisles. Eat your good meats. Get your good fats into your body because, again, from previous lecture, you heard how critical good animal fat is to building the structure of the cell wall. And everything in your child's body is made of cells. Everything in your body is made of cells. So avoid the middle aisles. Eat your good fats and eat your good meats. And number 3 is to do those 3 square meals a day. I think those are just wonderful takeaways for parents. And
that's right. It doesn't mean, you're right, it doesn't mean anything if you just do that 1 meal a day, right? We want to do it the way our ancestors did it, 3 square meals.
Exactly.
Imagine those black and white movies. I ask people, return to those black and white movies when, we sat down and they ate, the traditional way. Look at them. Look at My 3 Sons, Leave It to Beaver.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, those were the days. And we do need to go back and refocus, or we're going to lose our children much earlier. Either we're going to lose them emotionally, they're going to detach from us, and we could lose them physically earlier than us. So those are, if you don't have any other reason to change your family's eating habits than those 2 reasons, love your children enough to change the way you're feeding them because their bodies need certain elements. And Pam, thank you so much for being here today. The presentation was fantastic. And everybody, please go visit Pam's website. She's got tons and tons of valuable, clear-cut information there for you to get your family healthy. And if you don't know the answer, I'm sure you can try to have a consult with her and help her. And if you need her help do that, I'm sure she's willing to do that as well. So thanks again for being here with us today. And we appreciate you being part of the Healthy Kids Revolution. All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed Pam Killeen. And please, if you have any questions, also please go over to the Healthy Kids Revolution Summit Facebook page, which is just, facebook.com/the Healthy Kids Revolution, and post your comments, your thoughts, your feedback, your best tips. We're loving the community, wanting everybody to share their best practices because, again, it's going to take a village of all of us to raise our healthy children. Hope you enjoyed today's presentation and be on the lookout for Frida Moonkoch's Sugar Busting Blues the next go-around. Have a great day.